Well, in order to address the quest for Jesus traditions in Mark, as I was asked to do by the organizers of this very inspiring conference, I briefly want to talk about exegetical eyewear first, which is the first paragraph on your handout. In class, I work with the image of hermeneutical spectacles. In order to be able to change perspective, it's necessary to identify the reading glasses you already wear. And I must say, these are very handy reading glasses, although they tend to change my perception of reality. They might make me look a bit smarter, but still they change my outlook on the world. And I always feel extremely insecure when I'm not wearing glasses because I don't see properly. The refraction power of the lens indicates how biased my perception of the world and of a text is. Some reading aids help to clarify, others obscure. The point is to understand that we already wear corrective lenses and become aware of how they influence our perception. Some people even wear fake lenses to come across smarter or more learned. The exegetical equivalent to that would be theory shells that blow up opinions to the point that they actually block a direct encounter with a biblical text. Now let's have a brief look at exegetical eyewear and realize what we don't know instead of what we think we know for sure. First, the Gospel of Mark reaches us as a text only. It seems almost too barren to say it, but we tend to forget the simple fact: the Gospel of Mark reaches us as a text only. From the text as it is, it's not possible to say whether it was written by an individual or a group, which is whether there's one mind behind it or a whole set of minds. The text itself betrays next to nothing about the circumstances of its production. Assumptions about who wrote it for whom, be it an author writing for a community, the text being written by the head of a missionary school, or the memory of eyewitnesses being reworked in order to secure the knowledge for future generations, add something to the text and distort the attention to what is actually narrated. Second, we cannot track sources, only traditions. We have no tangible text that could count as a source for Mark. Whoever claims to be able to identify pre-Markan sources has to answer methodological and hermeneutical questions. Not only have 200 years of Markan research shown that it is impossible to reach a consensus on pre-Markan sources, which on top have usually been assumed to be homogeneous in genre, it has recently also been proven that form criticism is heavily biased, for it applies the rules of written culture to orality. It is beyond doubt that the Gospel of Mark makes use of sources as well as of cultural texts at hand, but the question remains, however, whether it's possible to say more than that. Thus, when working with the Gospel of Mark, it makes sense to assume earlier stages of tradition and their growth over a certain period of time, as well as oral and written sources and traditions, but it makes no sense to try to reconstruct them. Third, there are no tangible sources other than texts from the Hebrew Bible. The same problem occurs when we have a closer look at the cultural texts Mark uses to make sense of the Jesus event. Here again, we're dealing with a long shadow of historical critical hermeneutics and the underlying rules of literacy which are applied when it comes to the appearance of Israel's scriptures in the New Testament text. The research of intertextual dispositions, the appearance or allusions to text A in text B, has for a long time been conducted according to the principles of scribal culture, which is which text did Mark actually use, or which text did Matthew have at hand to quote from. The use of traditions and cultural texts in Mark is evident, but the same holds true for the difficulty to explain their origin and use. Whether the Jesus tradition and Jesus receptions negotiated into texts out of Jewish or pagan origin, and how and why they were adopted, is apart from obvious cases hard to guess. Fourth, our perception is coined by reception history and Wirkungsgeschichte. Let us remind ourselves how deeply our understanding is coined by the way we receive the text, Wirkungsgeschichte, and also by what we know or think we know about early Christian communities. There are some typical traps which have to be avoided in attempts to understand Mark as Mark. A. Reading other Jesus traditions into the text. Reading Mark means reading Mark. And in order to understand and do justice to Mark, the text should be judged on his own grounds. To adapt a famous phrase, we're not bound to show that what Matthew did to Mark turned out to be a literary, and I want to add theological, improvement on Mark. All we have to show is that Mark's plan was capable of attracting Mark. Whatever is regarded to be missing in Mark rather leads to speculations about sources and projection scenarios than to an understanding of the existent text. Mark reveals no knowledge of the so-called Sermon on the Mount, the Ascension, or Pentecost. Accordingly, the traditions found in later texts cannot be used to understand Mark and Mark's theological ideas. B. Reading dogmatic ideas into the text. I think the most prominent example would be the Roman Catholic tendency to explain away Jesus' brothers and sisters because they cause a problem, the dogma of perpetual virginity of Mary. Christological typos are equally powerful. We find it difficult to accept any straws in Jesus' behaviors because of our interpretation community's Christologies. Christological concepts and titles as categories provided by our religion traditions carry the danger of being read into Mark's text. A good example for this are the Christological concepts developed in the early Christian councils, which do not help to understand Mark. Christos, for example, has a different meaning for the Christians after the Council of Chalcedon or in the 21st century than in Mark times, where it might have been best understood to denote an eschatological messenger according to Isaiah. The same holds true for the Hios Theou. The title is prone to be misconceived according to the Trinitarian concepts developed much later. The adaptionist idea that has later been termed as heretical might not be that far from what Mark had in mind. We have to remind ourselves at times that early Christian heresies did not originate from ill minds, but could be deducted from the existing texts and were only excluded in social processes of identity formation. C. Reading exegetical concepts into the text. Our perception of Mark is coined by exegetical ideas. This is not a problem in itself, but might nevertheless obscure the understanding of the text. A good example is a statement from Udo Schneller's latest books, Die ersten 100 Jahre des Christentums, where he claims that the Messianic secret, a concept central to Mark, is simply ignored by Matthew, for he makes another idea the center of his gospel. Matthew's original sin sounds less dramatic when corrected according to the facts. The phrase would simply read, "The Messianic secret, a concept central for the Markan scholarship of the 20th century, is in fact ignored by Matthew." We would say, of course, boy. D. Reading the status questionis of historical Jesus research into the text. Although it might be tempting to team the latest findings of historical Jesus research with a Markan text, one should be careful. Trying to understand the Gospel of Mark, the focus must lie on what the Gospel narrates, not what might lie behind. As weird as it sounds, the most exhausting enterprise when reading Mark is to anesthetize whatever else I know and to make an effort to read the text and not the whole synoptic New Testament ecclesiastical tradition. The same holds true for the findings of Jesus research and the formation scenarios of the Gospel. Many of those are biased either by the omniscient view or meta-perspective of the postmodern scholar who has a much broader picture of the different developments that took place in different locations of the Roman Empire at the same time, or they are biased by the speed information travels at our times. The first generations of Christians were not only small in numbers and living in different and often unconnected locations, they also did not enjoy the blessings of Facebook, Twitter, and email. They could not switch on the news to give each other a buzz to process the latest developments. The simple thought experiment, how much longer it would take us today to write an article without the possibility to use the electronic library system, online resources, and the information stored either in the cloud or on your hard disk, let alone chats, email and Skype, or telephone in case you're more old-fashioned, to bounce ideas with colleagues around the globe, is helpful to realize how biased we are by a context that makes almost any information instantly accessible. To sum up, Mark does not come to us as a package deal, but on its own. All we have is the text, and any additional information, when it might have been written by whom and why, are secondary and later additions. Thus, for an investigation into Jesus' reception in Mark's Gospel, it is of minor significance whether Papias' testimony was to the point or not, and whether the author of the text was Peter's secretary, Paul's travel companion, or neither of them, whether the piece of work came into existence in Rome as an anti-gospel to the reign of Vespasian, or in Syria to console the traumatized survivors of the Judeo-Roman War. It's about time to reintroduce Occam's razor to biblical studies, as the important move is toward the text itself. What is really there? What does Mark narrate? Tisara Vutos Estin, who then is this, seems to be one of the most burning issues in Mark's Gospel. The facts are clear, it seems, but how is one to understand them? Making sense of the Jesus event according to the given traditions and locating Jesus in existent cultural frames in order to provide a new frame for future identity constructions might be one of the driving forces behind the Gospel of Mark. The question, who is Jesus, is crucial for the self-understanding of the Jesus followers, those in the 1st century and today. How Jesus is perceived has a deep impact on how Jesus followers spell out discipleship. To my perception, the Gospel of Mark does 3 things. A, it narrates the passion and resurrection of Jesus as the founding events of Christianity. B, it offers a model as to how Jesus can be understood. The Gospel of Mark does not claim that its way to understand Jesus is the only possible way, but makes quite clear what understanding Jesus in a certain way entails. C, it sketches a draft how discipleship looks like for those who have understood him in a certain way. And in this paper I will only deal with the first 2 points. In order to achieve this, the text operates on several levels, and I will address 2 of them today. A, on the level of narration, it narrates events and encounters with Jesus and portrays what every bystander could have seen. The key question is, what does Jesus do? How does he behave? B, the text also quite instinctively negotiates different impressions and perceptions of Jesus. These Jesus images occur mostly on the level of the characters. At first glance, the discussion and evaluation who Jesus actually is seems to be left entirely to the characters. Different characters come up with particular ideas about Jesus' identity and how he is best understood. Their ideas draw heavily on existing traditions and cultural frames. A lot of the traditions Mark is processing in his text can be found at that level. The key question thus is, which traditions and/or cultural frames are visible, and how can Jesus be understood in the light of traditions or existent cultural frames? Let us first have a look at the narration before we turn to the negotiation of the different Jesus images. Apart from calling the disciples, Jesus does not so much approach people, but people approach him. The whole situation reminds me of the working basis of the bigger shots in executive search. Don't call us, we call you. The word quickly spreads and people seek for Jesus, up to the point that he rarely finds peace and space, let alone time to eat. Jesus' reaction is to withdraw and hide from the crowds. The attempt to keep a certain distance is a constant and ever-occurring theme in the Gospel. The more he withdraws, the more he seems to attract people, and the more they search for him. Starting with the disciples' statement in 137, "Everyone is looking for you," the pattern is repeated several times. Be it Capharnaum or the region near Tyrus and Sidon, in the first part of the Gospel, Jesus cannot really hide. People seeking for help seek Jesus, and he withdraws and tries to do in a different location what he actually wants to do, which is teaching that the kingdom of God is at hand. Several occasions in the first chapters betray what is happening. People look for Jesus and follow him not because they want to hear what he has to say, but because they have heard that he has healing skills. Jesus becomes a healer and a public person rather unwillingly. Sometimes he's lucky and can teach for a while, but usually it does not take long until the next healing candidate shows and distracts attention. There is no end to people seeking him for health instead of salvation, which renders Jesus more and more unhappy. His outbreak, "Oh, unbelieving generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I put up with you?" reflect Jesus' frustration with the people who approach him on the superficial health level instead of turning to him on a deeper salvation level. No matter where he turns or how well he tries to hide, the sick and possessed are already there, seek and find him. And it's only in the second part of the Gospel, which means after night 30 and after leaving Galilee, that he finds some peace and quiet to teach at least his disciples. Jesus struggles with the fact that people, at least those he teaches and trains, are not becoming capable to solve the issues themselves. He is rather annoyed because they're so slow on the uptake. For him, after the encounter with God in connection with his baptism and the latency period in the desert, one thing was clear. A direct relation with God is opened and waiting for everyone. You just have to embrace it. Jesus calls this the kingdom of God, which is at hand, and it's as simple as that for him. Everything that hinders, obscures, and blocks the way to God and an intimate relation to God has to be done away with. His message is, the kingdom of God is at hand. Change your mind and believe in this good news. End of announcement. Apart from that, the content of Jesus' teaching remains rather pale. At a critical view, you also wonder how well-versed in his own Jewish traditions he is. The conversations in the temple would as well be seen as shrewdness. In 12:18 to 27, the argument is more agadic than halachic, and in 12:35 to 37, you wonder whether there is an argument at all. The discussion with the scribes and Pharisees in 7 and 10 refer to the common cultural frame, and it turns out Jesus seems to know some of the prophets and psalms better than the Torah. When he teaches the crowds, there are no references to the Torah. The teaching in 7 is in the same way based on common sense as the words about the scribes in 12 and the observations about the poor widow. Jesus' conversation with the Pharisees in Galilee were already less halachic than colloquial. The words about fasting draw from everyday image. The dispute about picking grain on Sabbath is even stranger. It has been the custom to assume that Mark got the story in 1 Samuel 21 wrong. It could, however, also be argued that the narrator deliberately depicts Jesus somewhat beside the fact in order to present him as an ordinary Galilean who is clever and rooted in his cultural frame, but nevertheless not a learned person. Someone perfectly ordinary who has met an extraordinary experience with God, which completely turned his life upside down. Jesus, lining up with his Galilean fellows at the bank of the Jordan, speaks as much for an ordinary contemporaneous Jew from Galilee as his behavior when he first enters the temple in Jerusalem. He looks around, and it takes 3 chapters to find out what he has seen and whether he likes it or not. One can be sympathetic with this Jesus who sees the small and is not too impressed with the large, who speaks in a plain and simple language ordinary people can relate to, and which is ambiguous enough to provoke those who have a say. What is most striking about this Jesus is the amount of time he needs to digest all this, the time he needs in silence, in communion with God, and in prayer. The Markan Jesus gradually learns both to understand how the encounter with God changed him and to deal with the crowds. But he does not seem to be a born charismatic. 5:30 to 33 nicely depicts a Jesus who is, to borrow a famous line, surprised by God. I can't help, but the more I try to anesthetize the rest of the New Testament tradition and the governing ideas developed in 2,000 years of interpretation history, the more I make an effort to meet the Markan Jesus in his natural habit, the more he comes across as some kind of Galilean culture. Mark's Jesus is a lot more rural than his synoptic and Johannine brothers. He avoids cities. He is ineloquent almost to the point of electricity. He is remembered as someone with an important message, but it never becomes completely clear what his message is, apart from unfolding the initial proclamation in 1:15. Jesus is rather received to be a gifted healer. In general, the content of Jesus' proclamation is less discussed by the other characters than the question who this Jesus is and how you best understand him. Which makes me turn to the second point, different perceptions of Jesus and how they are negotiated. The question, who is this then, is developed in different stages. In Table 1, I've structured it according to the estimated three main parts of the text. The first part, 1:16 to 18:26, introduces most of the different images the text deals with. Only the more political titles, Son of David, King of the Jews, and King of Israel, are introduced closer to the Passion narrative. The second part, 8:27 till 10:52, opens with Jesus' question for different perception categories discussed so far. The disciples mention John the Baptist, Elijah, or another prophet. Jesus asks them for their own perception, and Peter's answer, Su ei hoch Christos, repeats the narrator's understanding as introduced in 1:1. On the level of the characters, this understanding, although correct, comes too early, thus Peter is commanded to keep silent. Other than bringing up the messianic secret, the idea behind this scene could simply be to remind the reader of the adequate perception of Jesus. Such a reading is supported by the following verses. Jesus reminds the disciples and the reader of his self-concept, Son of Man, and his core proclamation of the Kingdom of God. Even more striking, the Transfiguration reminds the reader of the voice from heaven he and Jesus have already heard in 1:11. Now this voice is also audible to Peter, James, and John, who are only now introduced to the idea that Jesus is the Son of God. After this experience, Jesus commands them to keep silent until the Son of Man is raised from the dead. The disciples discuss this among themselves, not the disturbing scene or the voice from heaven, but what this means, resurrection from the dead. I do not read this passage as a testimony for the Jünger of the Verständnis, but as a narrative bridge to explain to the reader that Jesus is neither John the Baptist nor Elijah. After the beheading of the Baptist, the multiplication of the loaves has already implicitly communicated that there is more than Elijah. Jesus now makes it explicit. When applying eschatological schemes, you have to get them right. Elijah has to come first, but not Jesus is the returning prophet or the Baptist. Why not? Because he's the Son of Man. The reader might also hear the narrator say, of course we know better. Jesus cannot be the returning eschatological Elijah because he's the anointed one. Stupid. As regards the negotiation of the proper understanding of Jesus, according to Mark, the section 8:27 to 9:13 is interesting. Almost unnoticed by the characters, it negotiates and clarifies the different possible perceptions of Jesus to the point that only three categories are left: Christos, Son of Man, and Son of God. Although the narrator has a different opinion, Jesus is allowed to keep the context of Son of Man. Nevertheless, after the scene at Caesarea Philippi, Son of Man is successively linked to Christos up to the point that the eschatological parousia will reveal that both concepts apply to the same person. Although they appear again after 9:13, Kyrios, Rabbi, and Didaskalos are not part of the general negotiation of who Jesus is. The concepts newly introduced, Son of David, King of the Jews, and King of Israel, carry a political connotation. The explicit and hidden evaluations of the different perceptions, this is Table 4, guide the reader safely through the text. The negotiation on part of the characters, however, is not without a predetermined conclusion. The narrator has a distinct perception of Jesus and uses several literary techniques to get the message across. The third part of the Gospel, 11:1 to 15:37, does not return to a negotiation of different understandings. Jesus is simply confronted with different concepts by the high priest and Pilate. The high priest asks him whether he is the Christos and the Son of the Blessed One. According to the rabbinic custom not to utter the name of God, the question whether Jesus is the Son of the Blessed One is the same thing as to ask whether he is the Son of God. It's hardly a coincidence that the high priest asks for exactly the two categories that the narrator has introduced as adequate understanding of Jesus. Jesus' reply, however, is strange. Egoimi can be understood both affirmative or a use of the Offenbarungsformel. You shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven, can be seen once more as a correction to Jesus' own concept, Son of Man, as it is a direct quote from Daniel 7:13, which creates another eschatological link. Jesus' answer is thus remarkably ambiguous. It oscillates between affirmation, revelation, and denial. For the high priest, it is the blasphemy he wanted to hear, while the reader can also understand it as Jesus' final submission to the author's concept of who he is. Jesus' answer to Pilate's question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" is equally ambiguous. Syleges can be understood both as, "You got it right, man," and, "Well, that's what you say." The whole idea that Jesus could be perceived to claim being the king of Jews only comes in at this late point in the narrative and is only used by Pilate. The echo in the high priest and scribes mocking, "Let the Christ, the King of Israel, now come down from the cross so that we see and may believe," reflect that it is considered a political category which has little to do with Jesus' proclamation and the issues he had with the Jewish authorities. The reader is shaking his head about Pilate's ignorance. The kingdom of God Jesus proclaimed is about God being king, not Jesus, and any Trinitarian reading is simply beside the point. The evaluation of Pilate on the reader's part as someone who just did not get it has been carefully prepared by the narrator. He is depicted in analogy to Herod Antipas, who is also a weak character. Unable to get his will, he is subordinating to what other people want. Pilate seems to have got right the high priest's motives for Jesus' deliverance, envy, but this says more about how the narrator masks his own evaluation of the characters than about Pilate. Pilate is, in the end, cut down to a more or less unwilling executioner and has little else to add to the story. The epilogue brings the discussion to a close. It is another Roman official who, after the story seems to have ended but in the first possible moment, finally anchors Son of God to the human sphere of the level of characters. Up to that moment, it had only been on the divine and numinous sphere. The epilogue also adds a new dimension. Jesus can from then on be referred to as the crucified one. Let me conclude this paper with a few cursory remarks. Generally speaking, the different Jesus images processed in the Gospel offer different perspectives on Jesus, which can be actualized both in the Jewish and the pagan encyclopedia or background. I have researched this in depth for Mark 6 to 8, and the result was that allusions to Jewish cultural texts are manifest insofar as they are recurrent, while pagan cultural texts are latent. This is, they appear isolated and are neither connected nor readopted. This indicates that for Mark, there is no way around the Jewish cultural frame when it comes to a proper understanding of Jesus. Nevertheless, not every Jewish cultural frame that can be successfully applied to Jesus is regarded as helpful or appropriate in the Gospel's evaluation. The reception categories prophet, Elijah, Moses, son of David, and John the Baptist are discussed and dismissed. I would assume that these were current understandings, otherwise Mark would not have to deal with them. What happens in the Gospel is thus a typical feature of collective memory, the negotiation of reception categories. Another set of ideas is not directly dismissed, but not fully embraced either. The narrator lets the character Jesus introduce and advertise both the Son of Man and the kingdom of God, but does not adopt them. Both ideas are depicted as highly controversial, and the narrator does little to clarify the issue. In the end, this strategy might be best considered in analogy to the Hegelian Aufhebung. Mark proclaims Jesus as the Christos and Son of God, who understood himself to be the Son of Man and proclaimed the kingdom of God. The latter both seem to be prominent traditions which cannot simply be dismissed. But as reception history and Wirkungsgeschichte shows, the Son of Man tradition had its pipe in the Synoptics but did not last. This might be due much less to the delay of the parousia than sometimes estimated, but rather logical consequences of further developments in early Christian times, like the dismissal of the eschatological frames that Helen mentioned yesterday. Two final observations. A. The traditions possessed and evaluated positively in the Gospel of Mark are mainly derived from the Torah, the prophet Isaiah, and the Psalms. B. The two most prominent categories to understand this can hardly be a coincidence and should be further discussed, but without directly turning it into a hypothesis about the origins or the target audience of the text. Thank you.